Hey everyone and welcome back to the channel. So if you're new here, my name's Ray and I'm a second year Cambridge student here studying physics. And this is my friend Vishal, who is a first year maths student here at St. John's College as well. And Vishal sat the STEP exams, which are the maths admissions exams for Cambridge and a few other places. And he achieved the highest results, like grade-wise. He achieved S in Step 2 and Step 3. But if you don't know much about the structure, he'll explain that shortly. But as for the video, there will be a few resources which he will be referencing, and links to those will be available on his website, and a link to his website is in the description down below. So do check out his website during the video, and he also offers tuition services as well, and more information will be available on his website for that. So Vishal, do you want to kick us off by explaining what STEP is and the format and basically everything to do with the papers themselves for anyone who doesn't know?
STEP is the maths admissions test for Cambridge, and you are given 3 hours and there are 12 questions on both papers, so that's Step 2 and Step 3, and you're marked on your top 6 questions. You might be wondering why it's only Step 2 and Step 3. That's because there is a Step 1, but now Step 1 isn't being examined anymore. I'll be discussing Step 1 later in the video though. And STEP is used for several universities. It's used for maths at Cambridge, maths at Warwick, and computer science at Imperial, along with some other universities where it's used to reduce the offer. The assumption throughout this video is that you're applying for maths at Cambridge, but the information should still be relevant if you're applying to other universities. The timeline of the admissions process for Cambridge Maths is like all the other courses. You apply in October, by October, and then you get an interview in December, and then once you get your interview, you'll hopefully receive an offer in January. And the offer will consist of 2 parts. There's the A-level part and the STEP condition. So the general offer is an A star in maths and further maths, and then an A in your third A-level, followed by grade 1 in both Step 2 and 3. But some colleges, if you're a state school student, will also give you the flexible offer, which is 3 A stars and a grade 1 and a grade 2, where the grade 2 can be in either of the STEP papers. And that's colleges such as King's, for example. So STEP is graded with S as the top grade, then a grade 1, then a grade 2, and grade 3. And S is generally the top 10%, and then the next grade 1 is usually about top 30 to 40%, and then grade 2 is usually about 50 to 60%. These grades are used for different offers. So for Cambridge Maths, you'll be having to get grade 1 in both Step 2 and 3. But for Imperial Computer Science, you'll be expected to get at least a grade 2 in Step 2. And for Warwick Maths, you can be expected to get a grade 2 in Step 2 or Step 3. Grade S is sometimes also used in offers for Cambridge Maths. This is generally quite rare. So it's usually for things like if you're an international student, sometimes you could get an S1 offer, or if you apply to the same college after being rejected by them the year before, or some colleges can also give you an S1 offer if you've been pulled to them after your interview. But these are generally quite rare, and most people get 1-1 offers. The grade boundaries for grade 1 are constructed so that roughly 160 people achieve their offer out of the generally 550 Cambridge offer holders. And Cambridge is trying to fill 250 places for their maths course. So once those 160 people who get grade 1-1 or above have been accepted by their college, the next 90 are usually people who get for example 1-2 or 2-1 and things like that. The college will decide whether they'd like to take those students, or if they think that another college which isn't full will be able to take them, and that's being called put into the summer pool, where those different colleges will now look at their entire application, so their interview scores and their STEP grades, and decide whether they want to give anyone a place. Also, step 2 and step 3 are designed to be of the same level of difficulty, with the difference between them being the content. So step 2 will use both years of A-level maths, so first and second year, while only using the first year, so AS further maths content. While step 3 uses both A-level maths and further maths, so both years of both of them. And step 1 is designed to be less difficult than both step 2 and step 3, and it only uses content from A-level maths. So as I'll be talking about later in the video, it's a good place to start from when you're preparing.
Right, so that basically explains everything to do with STEP and what it is, in case you didn't know. But now, as for preparing for STEP, how did you go about preparing for it?
So what I started with was the STEP foundation modules, and these are mini assignments which have been developed by Cambridge. There's 25 of them, and each of them consist of a STEP question, usually from step 1, and they cover a wide range of topics in an attempt to make sure you're well prepared by the time you start doing other stuff after this, like papers. And generally they have some, on some topic they have a STEP question, but then before that they also have some easier questions to help prepare, to refresh your knowledge of it, or to teach you tricks which are useful in the STEP question. And then the STEP question itself, followed by what they call a warm down, which is just a fun little puzzle or something to kind of calm you down after the STEP problem.
Did you always do the warm down?
Generally I didn't do them, but
Right.
I feel like I should have, because they're generally very different in flavour to what you get in STEP, and probably more like what you get in the interview, with questions kind of out of left field, I guess. So the way I approached the foundation modules was I generally looked at the STEP question first and then tried it. If I could do it, then that means I knew that topic well enough and just moved on, because that means that the preparation and things like that won't be that useful. But if I couldn't do it, then I would look at the preparation and all the hints and then try the STEP question again. If you get really stuck, there's also solutions which have been written by Cambridge, and then I'd say generally it's, if you get stuck on a problem, especially with STEP, because they're designed to be really challenging and take quite a while, you should take a break from it, and a lot of the time that break will give you a new perspective when you come back and you'll be able to do the problem. But sometimes if you're really, really stuck, you could look at the solution and read the first line after you've got stuck, and that'll give you a hint to carry on. But generally you should try to solve as much of the problem as you can by yourself. After the STEP foundation modules, you'll notice on the website that there's also step 2 and step 3 modules, but these aren't really as guided as the step 1 modules. So they come in packs of several questions on a certain topic, such as calculus or mechanics or vectors and matrices and stuff like that. I generally found that these modules weren't too useful. I preferred to just go straight away with doing step 1 papers or step 2 or step 3 papers. But you should keep in mind that these modules also have what they call topic notes, and that's a really they're really condensed notes on that topic, which make it really good revision. Also, it's a good refresher of what's actually on the STEP specification, because it doesn't exactly match the A-level specification for maths or further maths. Cambridge decided to pick and choose some of their own topics to add in. When I started doing papers, I personally found that doing papers as timed mocks made it so that it actually forced me to do work, because when I tried to do standalone questions, usually I just ended up procrastinating or going on my phone or something like that. But how you when it comes to papers or individual questions, that's kind of up to you. I think another good thing about papers is that it keeps track of how you've been doing throughout, and where you've been improved and things like that. Something I noticed about halfway through my preparation was that generally my scores were a fair amount higher if I tried to do mechanics or statistics instead of just going for pure only. And that leads on to probably the most important thing I'll say in the video. The biggest piece of advice which all the first years I know gave, like after we all sat step, we wrote down a list of our advice for future candidates, and the main one which everyone said was to prepare doing statistics, because it looks quite annoying and quite ugly because it doesn't look very familiar. But once you look past the words with like the probability terminology and the notation and things like that, generally it splits into two topics which are much more like pure. And I think most people are more comfortable with pure maths than statistics or mechanics. So statistics splits into discrete and continuous probability. And the discrete probability is generally a lot about counting or combinatorics, which is like counting discrete objects and using that to find probabilities. And there's also the other type is continuous, where you generally are integrating density functions or and using that to find probabilities of a distribution. So these topics are usually quite familiar for people, especially the people who've been doing a lot of pure, because like integration, for example, is one of the biggest topics on pure in STEP. So I think they're really, really good once you get used to them. Like it'll take some time to get used to it, but it's definitely worth the effort. Now, the other applied section is mechanics. And mechanics, I think, well, personally, I found it quite a bit more challenging than pure and statistics, but I feel like it still is worth doing if you've got a lot of time, because having a wide range of questions to do in STEP is really important, because if you only have a small amount and then an ugly question comes up on the topics you like, you might be kind of screwed, because you could end up struggling a long time on a question when there was a different topic which you could have learned and that topic had a nice question. So I prepared for all three, and mechanics is like an extension of what's done in further maths, so with more difficult situations, sometimes more like things which are build upon the situations you've seen before in further maths, such as projectiles and collisions and simple harmonic motion and circular motion. But sometimes it's completely new situations. Like there was one step question about shooting a bullet into a block and considering the forces inside the block and how it slides. So generally I found that the questions which were easiest in step mechanics were the ones which required the least modelling, because modelling the physics is generally the hard part, I think, because once you've got the equations, solving them usually isn't too rough. It's generally just differential equations or a lot of algebra. So it's definitely worth, for even if you're not too keen on mechanics, it's definitely worth learning projectiles and collisions, because those questions usually are quite simple to set up and then just require a lot of fluency with algebra. And then after that, I would say the next easiest topics are circular motion and simple harmonic motion, because they generally follow the same sort of strategy with resolving radial and tangential forces and considering simple harmonic motion about an equilibrium point. And then I found things like centers of mass and moments the most difficult in STEP, because they rely on really precise modelling of the situation. So I think if you prepare for them in roughly that order, then mechanics will feel more approachable.
So when you said you were doing papers under timed conditions, whereas other people were doing standalone questions. So when you were doing the papers, you had to choose questions as though you were sitting the actual exam. Did you come back to the questions you didn't choose and attempt them as well, and treat them as standalone questions, or did you do the paper again and do all the questions that you didn't choose the first time, or how did you approach that?
So generally I went back and just did the questions as standalone ones, because the questions which I didn't do in the exam generally were the ones which I wouldn't be able to do that well. So that doing them as standalone gave me more time to think about them, and I guess less pressure. And
I suppose it also made you better at choosing questions as well.
Yeah, because I could assess whether like the questions I chose were the right ones and things like that. Once I did try doing the rest as a paper, and that was what made me discover that mechanics is a good idea, because the 6 I originally chose, there were like out of the 6 I didn't choose, there was actually some which I was better at out of the 6 I didn't choose than the ones I originally chose. And I feel like question choice is extremely important in STEP, because you could save yourself from doing a really difficult question. Like, once you've found the questions you can do, sometimes there's ones which are easier or more approachable, or you might like to, because sometimes in STEP there's topics which are not too difficult but require a lot of time or a lot of algebra. Like the main example which I remember is coordinate geometry questions, where generally you're going through a lot of algebra to find things like points of intersection and things like that. So in my mind, those were kind of like last resort questions. So, because generally I could do them, but if I made a mistake, then it'd spend a lot of time trying to fix it. And I should only really go for them if there's absolutely nothing else I can do. In contrast, there's the questions which are, like, I guess conceptually difficult, but slightly shorter. And you might like to go for those instead of the long and mistake-prone questions. So if you choose to do timed papers or going through like papers as mocks as your method of preparing, then it's probably better to start from doing the older papers, because generally the papers increase in difficulty as you get closer to the recent ones. Also, the STEP specification has changed fairly recently, so I think that was starting with 2019 papers, and they've added some things to the specification and taken some things away. So the main thing they've added is matrices, and there aren't that many questions on matrices now because of that, except really, really old ones. So what I did was there was a step 3 module on these, which didn't consist of step questions like the others, but I think was worth doing because they tried to find as many step-like questions as they could to help prepare for matrices questions. And there's also some really old spec matrices questions, so I think before the 2000s, and some of these are really old and use outdated topics such as group theory, while some of them are not too far off what could be asked today, such as 1998's Step 3 Question 5. Questions like that are worth doing for practice, but you should definitely prepare for matrices, because so far they've been generally among the more approachable questions in the papers they've been in. There have also been some things which have been taken away from the specification, such as moments of inertia in mechanics and conditional expectation and probability generating functions in statistics, which means now that statistics is even more approachable than before because there's even less content to learn. Like, generally you only need to now be comfortable with expectation and a couple of distributions, and then other than that, really it's just exam technique. Like, you won't need anything really specific, such as the things like chi-square tests from further maths stats, which is nice. You might like to learn conditional expectation though, because it's kind of fun and it's good practice as well for the other probability questions, but don't bother if you don't have much time. Whenever there was a topic which I felt like I was kind of mediocre at, like not one which I was good enough at to do in the exam, but not something so bad that I felt like even with lots of preparation I wouldn't be able to do it. So for me that was simple harmonic motion. I just went through every single question on simple harmonic motion in the database, just like what I did with matrices. So I think that's another good way to prepare, like preparing by topic. Because if you limit yourself to papers only, or like individual questions, you might just end up picking the questions which you like doing, such as doing the integral in every paper. And once you've done a lot of integrals, there's a point where you're just getting diminishing returns. So you should try to do questions on topics which you don't really like, because question variety, as I said before, is really, really important.
Right, so that basically outlined how you prepared for like doing the papers themselves. What about did you come up with any exam strategies for what order you do the questions in, or like which questions you'd be picking, or anything like that?
So what I did when I opened an exam paper was I read through all the questions and ranked each one of them out of 10 based on what the question looks like, the topic the question is, and like it was pretty much just instinctive. Like there wasn't really any process of how I ranked them. This kind of came from practice of a lot of questions. Like I knew that integration was a topic which I was alright at, so I usually ranked those as like a 9 or 10, while if a moments question came up, for example, which was my worst topic, I would probably rank that like a 5 or like a 4, because that's I might be able to do it, but it's very unlikely, so I should probably try to avoid that. And then once I did that, I just took the top 6 scores which I found, and if there's any ties, then I just kind of try to decide between the two. And then I just started from the first one and just tried it until I was unable to do any more, or I'd finished the question. So if I was unable to do any more, then I usually tried for a couple of minutes, and if I was making no progress then, and I felt like I wasn't going to make any progress in the next few minutes, then I just moved on to the next question, which was the next highest rated. And I think that's how this technique ends up saving time, because even like, it takes about roughly 5 minutes to pick the questions, but once you have picked the questions, that means that you won't be spending any time looking back through all the questions again to pick the next one to do. And it makes you a lot more calm when you're actually in the process of doing questions and jumping between questions, because you have a clear and fixed idea of what you're going to do next. That sort of structure to your exam is pretty useful. But some people like to take that structure and go even further with it and do things like 30 minutes per question, which you might like to try, but personally I didn't really like it because it was too structured and too rigid, and kind of would have made me feel like if I ended up spending longer than 30 minutes on a question, then I'd kind of think, well, what if I don't have enough time to do another one, and then start panicking. So I personally tried to go for something which gave me a good idea of what I'll do next, but not force me down a certain path or anything like that. Like, it lets me be a bit flexible. And about jumping between questions, it's just like before when I mentioned about how taking breaks from questions is good. Even the really small breaks you get from jumping between questions can also be helpful, because you'll come back possibly with a new idea of like your, like, I guess you can think of it as your subconscious working on that question as you're actively working on a different one.
So let's say you had done one question so far and you sort of stopped halfway through. You moved on to a different one and completed that one completely. Would you move on to the next rated question, or would you come back to the first one and try to see if you can now do that? So like the questions you stopped, would you basically come back to them after doing another question, or at the end of, like closer towards the end of the exam?
This one I actually didn't really think about much, but I think looking back at what I did in the exam, I feel like I would have just gone on to the next one, like the next new question, because once you start a question, it generally starts out quite easy and then gets to a more difficult part later on, which means that you can kind of be picking up marks really easily right away, and then once you hit a part which you can't do, then you can jump, because I like to ensure that I get a decent amount of marks quite quickly and then spend some time thinking later on. So I think for me in step 2, I did this with like my question 1 I was stuck on, and I kind of came back to it only right towards the end and hopped between that and another question which I wasn't able to finish, and in the end managed to finish it. On a related note, since you get marked on your top 6 questions, you should try to answer, like you shouldn't try to answer more than 6 questions, but you really should try to answer 6 questions, because generally the first few marks of a question are easier to get than the last few marks. So if you've not got much time left and you've not answered 6 questions, then it's better to work on the first parts of some other questions than to keep working on the final part of a difficult question. Another thing about partially done questions is that despite the front of the paper saying that it's better to try completely finished questions, a lot of the time the final difficult part of a question isn't actually worth that many marks. So you can sometimes get quite a lot of marks by doing the first couple of parts and leaving out the last difficult part, such as in some graph sketch questions. Generally they're structured to be like a lot of parts where you just gain more information about this strange function they're asking you to sketch. And then the final part is to put all that together and sketch the function. And that final part is usually the most difficult, and the other parts are just like some sort of guided algebraic manipulation or calculus and things like that. So they're not too bad. And those parts usually consist of the bulk of the question. So partials are generally worth quite a bit. Question 1 is usually designed to be more accessible. So that can be things like topics which more people have studied, such as like integrals, or like opening up with things like with parts which most people have done things like before. So it's like a more familiar sort of question. And a lot of people feel like they have to go for question 1 as part of their exam strategy. I personally didn't always go for question 1, but usually it ended up as one of the higher rated questions anyway. So don't feel like you have to do question 1, but usually it's designed to kind of ease you into the more strange maths which you'll find later on in the paper. Another thing to look out for is the question types. So one particular type is one where you're given a new idea and you're expected to work with it using techniques which you already know. A good example is 2009's Step 3 Question 4, which is about Laplace transforms. And this question looks quite hard at first, but part of the difficulty is getting used to this new idea. So the actual things you're asked to do aren't as difficult as other questions sometimes. So once you get past this new definition and these this new notation and things like that, like in this question in particular, you realize that it's just integration by parts, and that isn't too rough compared to other questions. Another thing to look out for as well is that some topics appear quite often. Like, you shouldn't take this as a rule, but almost every year, topics like integration, discrete and continuous probability, a matrix question, or a vectors question, or a sequences question, these are all really likely topics. So these topics are useful to prepare for because you're very likely to get a question on them. So while it's good to have a wide range of topics to be able to do in the exam, you don't need to force yourself to do all topics, because you might find a topic you really, really don't like, or you feel like you just won't be able to learn in time. For me, that was moments, because I just really suck at physics when it spins. And for some other people I know, that was complex geometry, because it was like really unusual from what was in A level. The good thing about the question choice is that then you can just completely avoid it. But you don't want to do this with too many topics, because then you leave yourself with too little to work with. Reiterating slightly something which has been said before, later parts of questions are generally the more difficult parts. You can think of these later parts of questions as like, if you were asked to do that part on its own, then they'd be really difficult. So generally, these more difficult parts rely on what you've had to work out throughout the question. So you should keep in mind trying to reuse what you've done before, because a lot of the time, you won't be asked to do something for no reason. Sometimes you'll get questions which say hence or otherwise, and almost always hence is better than otherwise, unless you already know. Like, the only way you should go for otherwise is if you already know a technique to do this question in a slightly faster way. But almost always hence is better to do. And similarly to that, there's also deduce, and that usually means that you don't need to work much harder to get the result they're asking for from what you've already worked out. As my last piece of advice about exam technique, in the real exam, something which one of the first years told me while I was an offer holder was to keep calm and think logically in the exam. And while that's easier said than done, I think at that point it is the most important thing you can try to do, because once you've got to the point of taking the exam, you've done as much preparation as you can, and there's nothing else you can really do. So you just need to try and stay focused in the exam. Like, it's really easy to start worrying about how during the exam you're running out of time because you just sat there thinking about the problem, because these problems are designed to be difficult. But that's normal, and that's what's intended. So it's not really much of a problem to have that happen. This is something which I had to deal with when I sat the MAT for Imperial in November, because I was getting really stuck on a question and I felt like this is what I should be able to do. And started to get really, really flustered because I was wasting time on a question which I should be able to really easily solve. And I became really conscious of how much time I was wasting, and then stopped thinking about the question or more about the time which I was wasting. And that made me perform a bit worse than I should. So I feel like that's another reason why doing mocks is useful, because doing mocks in real time gets you used to this situation of having to spend exam time thinking about a problem. And overcoming this, I feel like, is a really important thing for doing consistently in SEP.
So that basically covers a lot of like exam strategy related stuff. What about when you're doing the questions themselves? How many questions should you expect to do if you're aiming for, say, an S or a 1 or a 2 and stuff like that?
So for an S, generally you will need about 5 full questions. But this isn't really set in stone or anything like that, because partial questions can vary a lot in marks and can contribute a lot to whether you get like an S or a 1 or a 2. So for me, I got 4 fulls and 2 partials in both Step 2 and Step 3, but my Step 2 score was like a fair amount higher than my Step 3 one, because I think my partials were a lot stronger in Step 2 than they were in Step 3. While one of my friends who also got SS, he got 1 full and 5 partials. So there isn't really any fixed amount of full questions or partial questions you should be aiming for. You should just try to do as much as you can on each question, because like it's really easy to underestimate how much a partial can be worth. For a 1, it's kind of similar. Like the general advice is to try to get 4 full questions, but I think it's very reasonable to do like a smaller amount of full questions and some partials. And if you have really strong partials, you could even be getting S's or 1s with just partials alone. The only one where it can be slightly different is for a grade 2, where you can try to, like, if this is something you feel more comfortable with, it has a slight amount of risk, but because the boundary for a 2 is generally about 60 marks, you could try to get 10 marks or so on each partial, and then instead of trying to complete questions fully, you could force yourself to do 6 questions and try to get roughly like halfway or 2/3 of the way through them, and that could help you avoid the more difficult parts of a question. But whether you try that, that's up to you.
So when you're saying fulls and partials, so what do you mean by a full and impartial question?
A full question, I would say, is one where you've attempted every single part of the question and you feel like you've got a good solution to each part. So generally, to me, that's about 18 or more marks out of 20 on the question. A partial is one where you haven't finished the question. So there's like some part you know you haven't done, or you know you've done wrong. Then you can kind of like get varying versions of that. You can say a strong partial is one where you've done almost all of the question, or you've made a slight mistake, or things like that. And then there's also like weak partials where you've not done that much.
So most of the resources you've used, I'm guessing, will be on your website, but do you have any comments about any of the resources?
So on my website will be things like a table of grade boundaries and various mark schemes I've found throughout my time when I was preparing. There's also going to be a document about step tricks which I've come across during my preparation.
So a question I imagine a lot of people would have is, when did you start doing your papers, and how often were you doing all these past papers? Or what's your recommendation here for generally when people, and how often should people be doing these?
So I started with my Step 2 and Step 3 preparation in January. I was mostly doing like a couple of questions every now and then, but I did papers like quite slowly, probably a bit too slowly. So I was lucky that when A-levels were cancelled, because that gave me a lot more time to prepare for STEP. But in a normal year, you will also have to focus on preparing for your A-levels at the same time, because the A-level offer is still fairly high. So I would say that it's a good idea to do roughly 15 years of STEP papers, because after that you're likely getting diminishing returns, and it's better to focus on topics which you are struggling with and to do more of those than to do another integral or something like that if you're good at integration. I did 20 years and I feel like that was probably a bit too much. So if you're trying to do 15 years of papers, that's 30 papers altogether. So if you do roughly at the pace of 2 a week from January to June, then that will give you enough time to finish all the papers and to do some extra questions as well. Like, you should leave like at least some to what, like, close to the exam. For example, like, I usually left the couple like recent papers before my exam to give me the closest to my real exam experience. I did that with the MAT as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned Step 1 foundation modules being useful. When would you recommend people start doing them, and when should they be doing the papers themselves as well? Say the Step 1, 2 and 3 papers, providing they're doing all 3.
So I would say that you should try to do the Step 1 foundation modules within the summer of after year 12, because shortly after that you're likely going to be applying to Imperial as well, so you'll need some time to prepare for the MAT, which takes place in late October or early November. The Step 1 foundation modules will help with preparation for that, as well as for the interview which will come after that in December. And likewise about Step 1 papers, like, sometimes the topics in Step 1 papers can be useful for interview, like the curve sketching module for Step 2 can be useful, as well as curve sketches in Step 1. And I would say that while it's worth doing a couple of Step 1 papers, you shouldn't do too many of them. Like, I think I did like 4, and that was a decent amount before my interview, because there's resources specifically for the interview which are likely better to do than doing a lot of Step 1 papers, and some of those will be on my website, which is linked in the description. About Step 2 and Step 3 papers, I think that it's fine to just do nothing over the Christmas holidays after the interviews, but once you get your offer in January, it's likely a good idea to start doing some questions around then, like slowly build up into doing more and more questions later on, because you don't want to have to do the majority of your preparation at the same time as your A-level revision, which will be later on in the year. Something which I did was to try a Step 2 and Step 3 paper right at the start to see how I started and then like how I ended and things like that. But you don't need to do that, of course.
But yeah, that's basically it for the video. Hopefully you found it useful and learned some of the ways you can be preparing for STEP. Do check out Vishal's website in the description down below, and he does offer some tutoring services where there should be information available on that on his website, so yeah, do check that out. Hopefully you found it useful, and I guess we'll see you next time. Bye.
Yeah, bye.